It began like any other delivery day for Michael Carter. The late spring sun had just begun to warm the two-lane roads that threaded through his small Midwestern town. At 43, Michael had been running this same rural route for nearly a decade. Every turn, every mailbox etched into his memory. People along the way knew him by name, waved at his passing truck, and counted on his punctuality as much as the mail itself. That Thursday morning, he pulled away from the post office at exactly 8:15 a.m., his Grumman postal truck stacked with parcels, envelopes, and bundled newspapers. He followed the same route he always did, past the old grain elevator, down into the valley, along the gravel roads where the only traffic came from tractors and feed trucks. There was nothing remarkable about the morning. No one would later remember strange cars or unfamiliar faces. By mid-morning, Michael was halfway through his route, delivering to the more remote farms that lay on the fringes of the county. At 10:45 a.m., he handed a stack of envelopes to Mrs. Ellison, an elderly widow who swore he seemed just fine, friendly, talkative, his usual self. She watched him walk back to his truck and drive off. 20 minutes later, a local farmer named Carl Harris spotted the same truck parked on the side of an unpaved maintenance road that ran between two fields. At first, he thought Michael was taking a quick break, but as he drove past, something didn't sit right. The truck's driver's door stood wide open. The engine was still running. Inside, bundles of mail sat neatly stacked on the passenger seat. Carl slowed to a stop, stepping out to see if Michael was nearby. He called his name once, then again, louder. No answer. Michael's phone lay in the cup holder, his wallet in the center console. The driver's seat was empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no scattered mail, no tire marks suggesting a sudden departure. The only sound was the low idle of the engine and the faint rustle of wind through the surrounding cornfields. Carl drove to the nearest house to call the sheriff's department, a 15-minute trip that felt much longer. Deputies arrived quickly, treating the scene with urgency. They examined the truck, noting that the gear was in park, the keys still in the ignition. The mail route log showed Michael had several stops left on his loop. Officers fanned out along the road and into the adjacent fields, calling his name and scanning the rows for movement. When no response came, they widened the search to the tree line and the narrow dirt trail that led toward the old canal. By the time the first hour passed, their working theories had split between two unsettling possibilities: a sudden medical emergency that forced Michael to wander off, or foul play that had removed him from the vehicle entirely. Michael's wife, Linda, was contacted at home. At first, she thought it was a mistake, that he had just stepped away and would be back in the truck any second. But when deputies asked her about his health, his habits, and any recent changes in his mood, she began to understand the gravity of the situation. She told them Michael was in good shape, with no history of illness, and that he would never abandon his route, especially without contacting the post office. By mid-afternoon, word had spread through town. Residents who had seen him that morning replayed their encounters, searching for anything unusual, a strange expression, a comment that hinted at trouble, a car following behind. No one could recall anything that fit. For a man so deeply woven into the daily rhythm of the community, his sudden absence was like a missing note in a familiar song. Everyone felt it immediately. Deputies marked the coordinates of the truck's location, logged the inventory inside, and called in a K-9 team to start tracking from the open driver's door. As the search teams began to push outward, questions swirled. Had Michael been lured away under false pretenses? Had he seen someone in distress and stepped out to help? Or had someone been waiting for him at this isolated stretch of road, knowing he'd be alone? Each theory felt possible in those first frantic hours, but none explained why his belongings were untouched or why no one had seen him leave. The last delivery he made that day now stood as the final confirmed moment anyone had spoken to him, and it offered no clue as to what happened next. The sun began to sink, shadows stretching long across the dirt road, as the sound of his idling truck faded into the growing silence of a search that was only just beginning. Within an hour of the call coming in about the abandoned postal truck, the sheriff's department had transformed the quiet stretch of road into the center of a massive search operation. Patrol SUVs blocked off both ends of the dirt lane. their roof lights flashing in the pale daylight. Deputies moved deliberately, marking off areas with yellow tape, taking photographs and logging every detail into their reports. Word spread quickly through town, and within the first 90 minutes, dozens of volunteers had begun to arrive. Farmers stepping down from their tractors, shop owners closing early, neighbors pulling on boots and work gloves. The first K-9 unit arrived at 1 p.m., a handler guiding a lean German shepherd toward the idling postal truck. The dog's nose immediately dropped to the gravel at the open driver's door. For a moment it seemed promising, a steady, determined pull toward the shoulder, moving in the direction of the canal trail. But just 30 yards in, the dog stopped abruptly, circling once, then twice, before lifting its head and staring blankly into the trees. A second dog was brought in. The result was the same. The scent trail seemed to end in the middle of nowhere. Helicopters began sweeping the surrounding fields by early afternoon, searchlights cutting across the checkerboard of farmland. From above, the ground revealed tractor lines, irrigation ditches, and the silvery thread of the canal winding through the land. Teams on the ground moved in careful grid patterns, pushing through tall grass, wading into shallow creek beds, calling Michael's name into the heavy stillness. The canal's edges were muddy and unstable, forcing some to crawl on their hands and knees to peer into the slow-moving water. Deputies dragged long poles along the edges, hoping to catch on something beneath the surface. The poles came up empty every time. Back at the truck, detectives began piecing together what little they knew. The last confirmed sighting came from 81-year-old Marjorie Ellison, who lived along the route. She told them Michael had delivered her mail just before 10:45 a.m., stayed for a short chat about the warm weather, and seemed cheerful, exactly as he always did. She remembered watching him walk back to the truck, start the engine, and continue up the road. She had not heard or seen anything unusual after that. Based on the truck's location, detectives calculated it had taken him less than 5 minutes to reach that spot. The time between that delivery and when farmer Carl Harris found the vehicle could not have been more than 20 minutes. That was all the window there was, 20 minutes for a man to disappear. Investigators debated possibilities. If Michael had stopped to help someone, who was it, and where had they gone? If someone had flagged him down, they would have had to act quickly and without leaving any obvious sign of a struggle. There were no skid marks, no signs the truck had swerved or braked suddenly. His phone and wallet sat undisturbed, and the mail in the passenger seat was still neatly stacked. It was as if he had simply stepped out and evaporated into the landscape. Deputies moved door to door along the rural route, speaking to anyone who might have been outside that morning. A few residents mentioned seeing an unfamiliar dark SUV on a county road earlier in the day, but none could place it near Michael's last known location. Others recalled nothing at all out of the ordinary. A small number admitted they hadn't seen the mail truck at all that day, though they hadn't been looking for it either. By late afternoon, the sheriff's department had expanded the search radius to include several miles of farmland, wooded lots, and the canal's winding path. All-terrain vehicles were brought in to reach areas too dense or muddy for regular patrol cars. The K-9 teams were rotated, bringing in fresh dogs in case the first ones had been thrown off by the weather. The results were no different. Each trail stopped as abruptly as it began. At 6 p.m., Linda Carter arrived, escorted by a deputy. She stood silently beside the idling truck, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes locked on the open driver's door. The sheriff spoke quietly to her, explaining the steps they were taking, but the words seemed to drift past her. She later said it was the sound of the engine that unsettled her most, steady, rhythmic, and wrong, because Michael wasn't there to be behind it. She told them he had no medical problems, no reason to abandon his route, and would never leave his truck unattended. As night fell, portable floodlights were set up along the road, casting harsh white beams over the gravel and the surrounding fields. The volunteers kept moving, voices calling Michael's name into the dark. The canal became even more foreboding in the night, its surface black and unreadable under the searchlights. Deputies kept probing, pulling up clumps of weeds and sticks, never anything more. By 10 p.m., fatigue began to show. People moved slower, their voices quieter, the calls of his name less frequent. The sheriff ordered a final sweep before pausing the search until daylight, not because anyone wanted to stop, but because the darkness had swallowed the land entirely. The volunteers were thanked and told they'd be called back in the morning. Deputies lingered, standing beside the truck as if unwilling to leave it alone. The first day ended without answers. No footprints that could be matched to Michael, no dropped mail or personal item to suggest where he went. Not a single credible witness who had seen him after Mrs. Ellison. In a town where people knew each other's business without trying, it was unthinkable for someone to disappear in such a small window of time, in such an open place. As the last patrol car pulled away, the truck sat under the harsh floodlight, its paint dulled with dust, the low hum of its engine still breaking the silence. The open driver's door swayed slightly in the breeze, a mute reminder that whatever had happened to Michael Carter had happened fast, and had left nothing behind to explain it. By the second day, the search had shifted from a frantic sweep of open fields to a more methodical forensic examination of the land around the truck. The dirt road where Michael Carter's vehicle had been found was still cordoned off, deputies standing guard while crime scene techs worked in deliberate silence. It was early morning when one of them noticed a faint impression in the soft earth near the truck's front tire. On closer inspection, it appeared to be the heel of a boot. As they widened the search, more partial prints emerged, spaced in a way that suggested a person walking at a steady pace toward the narrow trail that led toward the canal. The pattern matched the tread of work boots, but the impressions were shallow, distorted by the uneven ground. They couldn't even say for certain if they belonged to Michael. The trail of prints continued for about 20 yards before stopping abruptly in a patch of matted grass. There were no returning prints, no scuff marks, and no signs of a struggle. The ground beyond was firm and dry, making it impossible to see if the person had continued walking or had been picked up by a vehicle. Investigators considered the possibility that Michael had followed someone or something toward the canal. But if that was the case, what had happened once he reached that point? The prints gave them direction, but no conclusion, a breadcrumb trail that simply faded into nothing. By midday, the whispers had begun. In a small town, silence was fertile ground for speculation. At the diner, at the gas station, even in the grocery store aisles, theories were traded as easily as small talk. Some said Michael had been in trouble, that there were rumors of unpaid gambling debts and quiet meetings with men from out of town. Others suggested there had been tension at home, that he and Linda were fighting more than they used to. To those who knew him, these claims sounded absurd, but the lack of answers made every rumor feel sharper, more plausible. Linda herself addressed the talk when a local reporter caught her outside the sheriff's office. With tears in her eyes, she said there was no truth to it, that her husband loved his work, loved their 2 children, and would never walk away from them willingly. The canal, once an afterthought in the search, now became the primary focus. It ran close enough to the trail for someone to reach it in minutes. Divers were brought in, the slow-moving current working against them as they descended into water thick with silt. Visibility was nearly zero. They worked by touch, running gloved hands over the canal floor, pulling up sticks, discarded fishing gear, and twisted metal from decades of neglect. Every hour they surfaced empty-handed made the reality sink deeper. If Michael had ended up here, the water was not going to give him back easily. On the banks, deputies combed through the weeds and brush, looking for anything that could connect Michael to the water. A torn piece of clothing, a dropped key, a letter from his route. Nothing surfaced. Even the dogs brought in to track near the canal showed no consistent lead, their behavior erratic, circling the same patch of ground before losing interest. Detectives began considering darker possibilities. If this was a robbery, why leave the truck running and untouched? If it was an abduction, why take him in broad daylight in a place where farm workers and delivery drivers passed regularly? And if it was voluntary disappearance, why leave behind everything that could sustain him? His wallet, his phone, his truck? The contradictions piled up, each theory collapsing under the weight of its own flaws. The town's mood began to shift. At first, the disappearance had united neighbors in common purpose, but as days passed without progress, a subtle division grew. Some were convinced Michael had been the victim of a sudden act of violence. Others believed he had chosen to vanish for reasons only he knew. The sheriff refused to entertain the latter theory publicly, but behind closed doors, investigators had to keep every possibility alive. On the third evening, after the divers suspended their work, one of them told a deputy that the canal's depth varied wildly along its course. In some areas, it was no more than 4 feet deep. In others, it dropped suddenly into channels carved decades earlier for industrial use. If something, or someone, had sunk into those deeper pockets, it could be years before it was ever found, if at all. The comment lingered with the detective in charge, a quiet acknowledgement that the canal might hold its secrets longer than anyone could bear. Linda avoided the growing gossip as best she could, focusing instead on keeping her children's lives steady, though reporters lingered outside the school and near her driveway. She had stopped answering questions that began with, "Do you think?" because none of them led to anything helpful. What she wanted was simple: to know what had happened on that quiet road between 10:45 and 11:05 that morning. Every night she replayed those 20 minutes in her head, trying to imagine what could have made her husband step out of that truck. The prints leading toward the canal remained the only tangible clue, yet they told no story that could be confirmed. They were a direction without a destination, a sign that Michael had moved away from the safety of his vehicle, but no evidence of what met him at the end of that path. And with every day that passed without discovery, the canal loomed larger in the minds of everyone searching, not just as a piece of land to be searched, but as a quiet, opaque witness to the moment he was last on this earth. The weeks after Michael Carter's disappearance blurred into months, and with each one that passed, the urgency of the search gave way to the grinding frustration of a case with no clear path forward. The sheriff's department kept the file active, but new leads were scarce. Detectives still checked the canal periodically, still interviewed anyone who claimed to know something, but the reality was setting in. Whatever happened on that stretch of road, the evidence had either vanished with him or was buried somewhere no one had thought to look. The FBI became involved briefly, their jurisdiction triggered by Michael's status as a federal employee. Agents arrived in dark sedans, reviewed the case files, and walked the site where the truck had been found. They conducted their own interviews, asking sharper, more pointed questions, even bringing in specialists to review the footprint photographs and the divers' reports from the canal. For a time, it felt like the case had momentum again, but within weeks, the agents were gone, their work folded into the county's existing investigation. Whatever they had found, it wasn't enough to move the case forward. Tips trickled in from across the state. One came from a gas station attendant 2 counties over who insisted she had seen Michael 2 days after he vanished. She described him as thinner, wearing a baseball cap and looking nervous while buying a pack of gum. The security footage was pulled, but the grainy figure in the video could have been anyone. Another lead surfaced from a man who claimed he had overheard an argument between Michael and a stranger in a pickup truck a few days before the disappearance. When pressed for details, he admitted he couldn't remember the exact date, the location, or even what was said, only that it had been heated. Detectives checked every report of a suspicious pickup in the area that month, but none could be tied to Michael. Linda kept the pressure on the investigation, calling the sheriff's office regularly, speaking to reporters, even attending county meetings to demand more resources. But the strain of living in the same house where Michael had left for work that morning became too much. By the following spring, she sold the family home and moved with their children closer to her parents. It wasn't a decision she made lightly. The house was full of memories. But every time she drove past the route he had taken that day, the ache returned fresh, as though it had happened hours earlier. In town, the disappearance was no longer the first thing people talked about, but it was never far from their minds. The canal had become an unspoken symbol of the case, its still, murky water serving as a reminder of what was unresolved. Some people avoided it entirely, while others found themselves drawn there without knowing why. Fishermen who had spent decades on its banks said they had never looked at it the same way again. As the 1-year anniversary approached, Linda and a small group of friends organized a candlelight vigil along the canal's edge at the point closest to where the boot prints had been found. It was a warm evening, the sun setting in a smear of gold before the sky faded into a deep blue. Dozens of people gathered, neighbors, co-workers from the post office, classmates of Michael's children. They held candles, their flames flickering in the breeze, and stood in a long, uneven line facing the water. Someone spoke about Michael's dedication to his job, about his kindness to the people on his route, about the way he remembered birthdays, and asked about people's families. Others prayed silently, their eyes fixed on the dark surface of the canal. Linda stood near the center, her children on either side, her face pale in the candlelight. She thanked everyone for coming, her voice trembling only once when she said she would never stop believing that someone, somewhere, knew the truth. The vigil ended quietly, people setting their candles along the bank before walking away in small groups. For a few moments, the only light came from the tiny flames reflected on the water, wavering in the ripples. Then, one by one, they went out, leaving the canal in darkness again. It had been a year, and the trail was as cold as it had been on the first night. But the way the crowd lingered, glancing back toward the water as they left, made it clear that for many, this was the place where the answers waited. Answers that no one had yet been able to reach. 2 years after Michael Carter vanished, the investigation had settled into a grim rhythm. Periodic tips, quick follow-ups, and the same deflating return to nothing. Then, in early autumn, a call came in that jolted the case back into motion. Hunters in a dense woodland, nearly 50 miles from where Michael's postal truck had been found, had stumbled across what they believed were human remains. Deputies secured the site within hours, and by the time word reached the sheriff's office, the hope was immediate and sharp. It was far from Michael's route, but the passage of time had taught investigators that distance didn't rule anything out. The discovery was unsettling in its stillness, a partial skeleton scattered among fallen leaves, clothing long decayed, a pair of worn boots half buried in the dirt. The remains were sent to the state crime lab for analysis, along with a request for expedited dental comparison. For Michael's family, the weight was unbearable. Linda had always clung to the idea that no news meant her husband might still be alive somewhere. But now she found herself bracing for confirmation that would erase that hope entirely. When the results came back, the case took a jarring turn. The remains did not belong to Michael. Dental records identified them as a missing hitchhiker from another state, last seen nearly a decade earlier. There was no connection between him and Michael, no overlap in their lives or timelines. The emotional whiplash was brutal. For the Carter family, the momentary surge of hope for answers had been replaced with the same emptiness, now edged with fresh grief. For investigators, it was another road that led nowhere, though it had consumed days of manpower and reignited public attention. Still, the flurry of renewed coverage shook loose details that had been buried under 2 years of fading memory. A neighbor who lived just over a quarter mile from where Michael's truck had been found came forward with something she claimed she hadn't thought about since that morning. Around the time the truck would have been parked, she had seen a dark SUV pass by her property. It wasn't one she recognized, not a model driven by any of her neighbors, and she had noticed it because it seemed to slow as it approached the stretch of road where the postal truck was later discovered. She didn't see the driver clearly and couldn't provide a plate number. Detectives pressed for specifics, but her recollection was hazy. Had it been before or after the truck was parked? She couldn't be sure. Did it stop or just slow down? She thought it had hesitated, but maybe that was her imagination filling in the gaps. In the absence of hard details, the lead was both tantalizing and frustrating. A dark SUV wasn't much to go on. It could have belonged to a local, a passing traveler, even a farm hand from another county. They ran what little they had through DMV records, checking for vehicles matching her vague description, registered within a reasonable radius. The list was too long to be practical, and without a plate or identifying mark, it was impossible to narrow. No other witnesses recalled seeing the SUV that day. The farmer who had first spotted Michael's truck insisted he'd passed no vehicles on the road before finding it. The more the SUV detail was examined, the more it highlighted the fragility of the timeline. If the neighbor was correct, then the truck and the SUV were in the same location within a narrow window before Michael's disappearance was discovered. If she was mistaken about the time, the entire sequence of events could shift in ways that changed the scope of possible explanations. It was enough to reignite quiet speculation among the investigative team that maybe Michael hadn't left his truck willingly at all. For Linda, the SUV detail was one more unanswered question in a list that had grown unbearably long. She tried not to dwell on it, knowing it could lead nowhere, but it was difficult to push aside the image of her husband pulling over for a stranger on that empty road. She replayed the morning in her head yet again, the way he'd left for work without any sign of distraction or worry, the normal rhythm of a Thursday delivery route. There had been nothing in his mood, his routine, or his behavior to hint at trouble. The investigation into the remains closed quietly, the other man's family finally receiving the closure the Carters still lacked. But for Michael's case, the renewed activity underscored a painful truth. Every promising lead had the potential to collapse into nothing, and every collapse deepened the sense that the answers might always be just out of reach. Still, the image of that unfamiliar SUV lingered in the minds of both detectives and the people who lived along that route, a shadow in the timeline that no one could prove was connected, yet no one could fully let go of. It was the kind of detail that, if true, could rewrite the story of Michael's disappearance entirely. If only they could figure out who had been behind the wheel. 7 years after Michael Carter vanished, the case file had grown thick with reports, interviews, maps, and photographs. But for all its weight, it was still empty of answers. By then, most of the original investigators had either moved on to other assignments or retired. The file sat in the cold case cabinet, a reminder of a story that had unsettled the county but gradually slipped from daily conversation. That changed when Claire Dawson, a young detective barely into her 3rd year with the department, was handed the file as part of a push to reassign unsolved cases to fresh eyes. She had been 13 when Michael disappeared and still remembered the news coverage, the vigils, and the way her own parents spoke about it in hushed tones. Now, with the file in her hands, she was determined to look at it differently, not as a story she had grown up hearing, but as a puzzle that could still be solved. Claire's first weeks on the case were spent reading everything, from the initial incident reports to the smallest handwritten notes in the margins. She drove out to the road where the postal truck had been found, stood in the exact spot where the boot prints had ended, and walked the narrow path to the canal. She studied photographs taken during the original searches, noting what was visible and what had been obscured. One detail kept gnawing at her. The canal had been searched, yes, but only in a limited capacity. Divers had covered certain sections near the trail, but the waterway itself was far more extensive than those early efforts suggested. Tracing the canal on a map, Claire saw that it ran through 3 counties before feeding into an industrial lock system miles away. Old engineering documents revealed that it had been dug deep in certain stretches to accommodate boat traffic decades earlier, and that years of neglect had allowed debris and silt to accumulate at an alarming rate. Maintenance records from the time of Michael's disappearance showed entire sections where visibility was near zero and the bottom was buried under layers of sediment. In those areas, divers would have been operating blind, relying on feel alone. The more she read, the more Claire realized the canal had been treated as a search location, but not as a primary suspect in the case. It was as if the investigative focus had been on the land, the truck, the footprints, the road, with the water serving as a background element. But to Claire, the canal wasn't background. It was an unsearched corridor, a place where something could be hidden in plain sight for years. If Michael had gone into that water, intentionally or by accident, the conditions at the time would have made finding him, or even the truck, nearly impossible. She began digging into local government archives, requesting environmental and maintenance reports dating back more than a decade. She learned that the canal had undergone only partial cleanups in the last 20 years, usually to remove surface debris or clear small blockages. Larger submerged objects were often left in place if they didn't impede flow. In other words, if something big had gone in, it might still be there. When she met with older maintenance workers who had been around during that era, she heard stories of cars, farm equipment, even entire dumpsters resting on the canal bed. One man told her he wouldn't be surprised if there were dozens of unaccounted-for vehicles down there. Claire asked if any major cleanouts were planned. That's when she learned about the upcoming canal cleanup project, scheduled in partnership with an environmental group to restore several miles of the waterway, including sections that had been inaccessible for years. It was the kind of opportunity she knew might never come again. The cleanup would involve partial draining of certain sections, heavy equipment to remove debris, and divers working systematically through areas that had never been searched thoroughly. If she could attach her investigation to the project, she could explore the canal in a way that had never been done before. But first, she would need approval, funding, and manpower. Claire began preparing her case for the sheriff and county board. She compiled side-by-side images of the original dive zones and the untouched stretches downstream. She showed the silt depth records, the maintenance notes warning of dangerous drop-offs, and photographs of large objects removed in past cleanups. Her argument was simple. If Michael Carter's disappearance had anything to do with the canal, this was their one chance in a generation to find the evidence. As she built her presentation, she also reached out to Linda Carter. It had been years since the family had heard anything new, and Claire wanted her to know that someone was still fighting for answers. Linda was hesitant at first. Years of disappointment had made her cautious, but as Claire explained the scope of the cleanup, something shifted in her voice. She agreed to support the request publicly, knowing that a show of family involvement could help secure the resources Claire needed. In the weeks leading up to the county board meeting, Claire found herself walking the canal's edge alone in the evenings, taking in the slow current and the way it reflected the fading light. She thought about how close it ran to the spot where Michael's boot prints had ended, about how easy it would have been for a vehicle or a person to slip beneath its surface without a sound. She knew that even if the cleanup revealed nothing connected to the case, it would at least put to rest the possibility that had lingered for 7 years. But in her gut, she didn't believe it would be empty. She believed the canal still had something to say. The cleanup began on a cool morning in early spring, the kind of day when the air carried the damp smell of earth and water. County workers and volunteers from a local environmental group lined the canal's edge, armed with waders, nets, and heavy equipment. Their goal was to clear years of accumulated debris from a mile-long stretch of the waterway, part of a broader restoration project that would restore flow and improve safety. It was tedious work, pulling up discarded bicycles, rusted lawn chairs, bundles of tangled fishing line, and tires worn smooth by years underwater. Every so often, the crane would hoist something larger from the silt, the onlookers reacting with a mix of curiosity and mild surprise before turning back to their own tasks. Detective Claire Dawson kept her distance at first, watching from a grassy embankment. She knew these early hours were about removing surface clutter, the easy things visible in the shallows. The deeper work would come later, when the pumps had lowered the water level enough to expose the canal bed in certain sections. By midday, that moment arrived. The pumps groaned steadily, sending water into temporary holding basins, and the volunteers worked knee-deep in the muck, pulling out debris that had been buried for decades. It was during one of these sweeps that a county worker spotted something protruding from the thick silt near the center channel, a chunk of rusted metal, curved in a way that suggested it had once been part of a vehicle. At first, it drew little attention. Car parts were not uncommon in canals. Years of accidents, dumping, and flooding had left their mark. But as he cleared away the mud, more of the object emerged, revealing a bumper twisted nearly in half. He tugged at it, but it wouldn't move, and in the process of shifting the muck, faint traces of white paint appeared. A volunteer leaned in for a closer look, wiping at the surface with a gloved hand. The letters were faint, barely visible beneath layers of corrosion, but there was no mistaking them. USPS. The worker froze, then straightened up and called for a supervisor. Within minutes, the site was cleared of unnecessary personnel, and Claire was at the water's edge, staring down at what was now unmistakably the rear section of a vehicle buried in the canal floor. Specialized recovery crews were brought in, their winches and straps designed for delicate extractions. It took hours to dig the object free from the silt, every movement slow and deliberate to prevent further damage. As the water around it churned with sediment, the outline became clearer, the boxy shape of a Grumman postal truck, its frame warped and bent from years underwater. When it finally broke the surface, dripping and heavy, the sight was surreal. Mud streamed from the open back, and the once white paint was mottled with rust and algae. Onlookers stood in stunned silence as the truck was lowered onto the bank. Claire moved quickly, circling it as if to convince herself it was real. The headlights were gone, the windshield cracked in a spiderweb pattern, but enough of the structure remained to make it unmistakable. It was the same make and model Michael Carter had driven the morning he disappeared. The confirmation came hours later, when the VIN number, painstakingly cleaned and read by an evidence technician, matched the records for Michael's assigned vehicle. News of the find spread rapidly, traveling from the cleanup crew to local law enforcement and then to the press. By late afternoon, reporters were on site, their cameras trained on the truck as deputies erected tarps to shield it from view. For the community, the discovery was more than just a piece of missing property. It was the first undeniable physical connection to Michael in 7 years. For his family, it was a gut punch, the hope of a miraculous return colliding with the reality that his truck had been hidden in the canal all this time. Investigators moved in quickly, treating the site as an active crime scene. Every inch of the vehicle was photographed before the doors were pried open. The smell of stagnant water and silt poured out, mingling with the metallic tang of rust. In the cargo area, bundles of mail were still stacked in their plastic sleeves, the addresses visible but the paper warped and discolored. In the cab, the driver's seat was buckled, the dashboard coated in a thick film of grime. It was impossible not to imagine Michael behind that wheel on the morning he vanished, the truck intact, the road dry beneath him. Claire felt the weight of the moment pressing on her. She had pushed for this cleanup believing the canal might hold answers, but she hadn't dared to imagine the scale of what they'd find. The truck's presence here changed everything. It meant Michael hadn't walked away from it willingly, and it meant whatever happened had taken place much closer to the water than anyone had proven before. As the tow crew prepared to move the truck to a secure facility for forensic examination, the onlookers remained, watching in silence. The sound of the winch echoed across the canal, and for a brief moment, the only thing anyone could focus on was the dripping, corroded shell that had somehow evaded discovery for nearly a decade. It wasn't the answer, not yet, but it was the first undeniable step toward one. When the postal truck was finally secured at the county evidence facility, the priority shifted from recovery to examination. Floodlights illuminated its rusted frame as forensic technicians, clad in waterproof suits and gloves, began the slow process of documenting every angle, every detail. The driver's side door bore the most visible damage, twisted along the lower hinge, the metal crumpled inward, yet not in a way that suggested it had been pried or forced open. It looked more like impact damage, as though the truck had struck something heavy before coming to rest. The lock mechanism was still functional, the handle stiff from corrosion, but intact. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of long stagnant water and decayed organic matter. Mud coated every surface in a film that had to be scraped away in layers. The driver's seatbelt was buckled, the fabric stiffened by years underwater and the buckle still locked in place. In the cargo area, bundles of mail sat in neat stacks, each one sealed in its original plastic wrapping. The plastic had done its job. Addresses could still be read, postmarks still visible. Some envelopes had warped, others were blackened by water intrusion, but the majority had been preserved in a strange, silt-packed time capsule. It was the audio driver's seat that drew the most focused attention. Beneath the layer of sediment, forensic techs uncovered human remains, positioned in a way that left little doubt the person had been sitting there when the truck entered the water. The skeleton was largely intact, the posture suggesting the body had remained restrained by the seatbelt for years, undisturbed. Fragments of fabric clung to the bones, the faded blue of a USPS uniform shirt, the stitching on the chest pocket still visible under a coating of grime. On the left breast, A corroded metal name tag clung stubbornly to the fabric, the letters dulled but legible. M. Carter. As the remains were carefully removed, each piece was photographed in place, then placed into labeled evidence containers. The skull was examined first, revealing no fractures, no obvious signs of blunt force trauma. The same absence of injury was noted along the ribs and limbs, no breaks, no defensive wounds. If there had been an act of violence, it had left no trace on the bones. Toxicology would be impossible after so many years, and soft tissue evidence had long since disappeared, leaving the manner of death a puzzle with few pieces. The immediate speculation among those on site was that the scene pointed toward an accident. The buckled seatbelt, the undisturbed mail, the lack of defensive injuries. It painted a picture of Michael driving into the canal and never escaping. But the simplicity of that theory didn't sit well with everyone. Claire Dawson, standing near the truck, kept her eyes on the bent driver's side door. If the accident had happened in daylight, along a route he knew by heart, how could the truck have gone into the water without a single witness? The canal's banks weren't invisible. The road where his truck was last seen wasn't busy, but it wasn't completely isolated either. And why had the original search divers, operating only yards from where the truck was now found, never located it? As the examination continued, one small but nagging detail emerged. The driver's window was rolled halfway down. In an accident scenario, especially one involving a sudden plunge into water, it was common for drivers to roll the window down in an attempt to escape before the electrical system failed. But Michael's seatbelt had been fastened, his body still restrained. It suggested no attempt to flee, or perhaps no time to react at all. Claire noted each detail, filing it away against the possibility that the accident theory wasn't the whole story. If the truck had slid in quietly, perhaps on a part of the bank that gave way under its weight, there would have been no splash loud enough to draw attention. But even then, the absence of any clear entry point, skid marks, or displaced earth along the banks near the discovery site troubled her. It felt as though the truck had entered the canal not at the point of recovery, but somewhere upstream, carried here over time by the slow current, sinking into the deep silt where it was finally found. For the Carter family, the confirmation that Michael had been inside the truck was the first definitive answer in 7 years, but it came with no explanation that made sense. His children, now young adults, stood with their mother outside the facility, choosing not to see the vehicle or the remains. Linda later said she had imagined this moment countless times, always wondering if it would bring relief. It didn't. The truck had returned, but it had brought the same question back with it. How could a man disappear in broad daylight in a town where everyone knew his face and remain hidden for so long? As the evidence team logged the last of their findings for the night, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the truck's recovery wasn't the end of the search, only the beginning of a new one. The accident theory was neat, but the facts weren't lining up as cleanly as they should. And somewhere, in the miles of water and mud that still separated the discovery site from the place Michael had last been seen, she believed the rest of the story was waiting. In the days after the truck was pulled from the canal, Claire Dawson buried herself in research, convinced that the answer to how it ended up there lay not in the vehicle itself, but in the geography of the area as it existed 7 years earlier. She requested copies of county survey maps, road maintenance records, and aerial photographs from the year Michael disappeared. At first glance, nothing stood out. The same rural lanes, the same main routes he would have traveled every day. But one map, older than the rest, showed something the others didn't. A thin, unmarked line running parallel to the canal for nearly half a mile. It was labeled only as service access, a dirt track used decades ago for canal maintenance. On more recent maps, it was gone entirely, overgrown and erased from official records. Claire took the old map into the field, parking near the stretch where Michael's last deliveries had been made. She found the entrance almost by accident, hidden behind a curtain of saplings and waist-high weeds. The track was little more than 2 ruts carved into hard-packed earth, now softened by years of neglect. Following it on foot, she realized it hugged the canal bank far more closely than the main road ever did. In some places, the water was less than 10 feet from the edge. The soil under her boots crumbled in spots, a reminder that the bank wasn't stable even in dry conditions. To understand why Michael might have been on this road, she began contacting retired postal workers who had served the area around that time. Several were surprised she even knew about the track, but one man, a former route supervisor, admitted it had been something of a local secret among drivers. On long days, especially in bad weather, it could shave nearly 10 minutes off the time between two rural stops. Officially, it wasn't part of any delivery route. It was never on the logs, but the temptation to use it was strong. If you knew it was there, he told her, you used it. The pieces began to align. If Michael had taken the shortcut that day, the location where his boot prints ended made more sense. The service road ran right behind that spot before curving closer to the canal. But the more she thought about it, the more dangerous it seemed. The bank there was narrow, with little more than a sloped edge between the road and the water. There were no guardrails, no barriers of any kind. One slip, one patch of soft ground, and a vehicle could tip directly into the canal. Claire pulled weather records from the week of Michael's disappearance. They showed what she had suspected. Record rainfall for that time of year, including a steady downpour the night before he vanished. Combined with the narrow, unmaintained track, the bank would have been saturated, the soil soft enough to give way under the weight of a postal truck. If that happened, the vehicle could have slid silently into the water, the mud and current swallowing it before anyone driving the main road could see. But one question remained. Why hadn't this been found during the original search? Looking at the map, Claire realized that in 2016, when the divers entered the canal, the focus had been on the area directly adjacent to where the truck was discovered years later. No one had searched upstream near the old service road, likely because it was no longer recognized as an access point. If the truck had gone in there, the slow-moving current and heavy silt could have carried it gradually downstream, settling it into the deep pocket where it was eventually found. She returned to the site again, this time with a county engineer who confirmed her theory. He pointed to the erosion patterns along the bank, showing her where the earth had collapsed in recent years. One section matched the exact curve on her map, and when she stood there looking at it, she could almost picture the moment, Michael turning onto the track, maybe to make up time, maybe to avoid a muddy section of the main road, unaware that the ground beneath him had been weakened by the rain. The theory was simple, almost too simple for a case that had grown so tangled over the years. Yet it explained the details that had never quite fit. The lack of signs of struggle, the absence of witnesses, the reason the truck had been invisible to searchers for so long, and it gave a plausible path from his last confirmed delivery to the water where his route had ended forever. Still, Claire knew that without direct evidence from the bank itself, it remained a theory. The service road was nearly gone, swallowed by trees and time, and the rain that had likely caused the collapse had washed away any trace long before the first deputies arrived on scene. But as she looked out over the water that morning, watching the slow current slide past the point where the road used to be, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was where it had happened. The quiet, forgotten bend where the canal had taken in a man and his truck without leaving a ripple for anyone to see. The reconstruction began with the maps, the old maintenance records, and the weather data from the week Michael vanished. Investigators plotted the route he had been scheduled to take that morning, then marked the narrow, long-forgotten service road that paralleled the canal. Using the statements from retired postal workers and the evidence gathered from the site, they traced a plausible scenario. Sometime after delivering mail to his last confirmed stop, Michael turned off the main road and onto the shortcut, a choice that would have shaved minutes off his route. It was something other drivers had done countless times before. What he couldn't have known was that the previous night's record rainfall had soaked the soil along the canal's edge to the point of failure. Forensic engineers examined the bank where the service road met the water, noting the way it sloped sharply toward the canal, the loose earth still prone to crumbling under weight. They explained how a heavy vehicle could shift the balance in seconds, the ground giving way beneath the tires, the truck sliding sideways before plunging silently into the water. There would have been no dramatic splash, No engine roar echoing across the fields, just the muffled thud of impact, followed by the hiss of water rushing in. The driver, restrained by his seatbelt, might have had only moments to react before the truck was pulled under. In the reenactment, a model vehicle rolled down the sloped bank and disappeared beneath the surface in less than 10 seconds. The canal's murky water and thick silt acted as a shroud, concealing the vehicle almost immediately. Within minutes, the disturbed sediment settled, leaving no trace visible from above. Anyone driving past on the main road that day would have seen nothing but still water. The accident had occurred in a place no one thought to look, along a road most didn't even know existed. This explanation tied together the loose ends that had haunted the case. It accounted for the lack of visible struggle, the sudden disappearance without witnesses, and the reason divers had found nothing in the days and weeks after the search began. The truck had likely entered the water upstream and been carried by the slow current into the deep pocket where it was finally found years later. There had been no chase, no ambush, no plan to vanish, just a split-second collapse of Earth on a forgotten path. For the Carter family, the official conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. After years of imagining every possible scenario, from abduction to foul play, the truth was that Michael had been lost in a quiet, accidental moment. There was no one to blame, no crime to prosecute, no hidden conspiracy to unravel. Just bad timing, bad weather, and a decision made in routine that ended in tragedy. Linda listened to the findings in the sheriff's office, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't cry at first. She said she had always believed he would never leave them by choice, and this proved her right, though the confirmation carried no comfort. A week later, she stood by the canal with her children, near the place where the bank had given way all those years ago. The cleanup crews were gone. The water level returned to normal, the current moving with its slow, indifferent rhythm. She told them this was where their father's route had ended that day, not at the last mailbox he stopped at, but here, in a place hidden for so long. They stayed for a while in silence, watching the water, each of them picturing the man they had lost in their own way. For the community, the recovery and conclusion brought an end to one of the most haunting mysteries the county had ever seen. The candlelight vigils, the whispered theories, the unanswered questions, all were replaced by a single, sobering truth. Michael's disappearance had been an accident, but one so perfectly concealed by nature and circumstance that it had defied discovery for 7 years. When the case file was finally closed, Claire Dawson kept a copy of the old map with the faded service road marked in pencil. She said it was a reminder that sometimes the smallest, most overlooked details are the ones that matter most. And though the ending was tragic, it was also, in its own way, a resolution, a way to bring Michael home, even if it was only in the form of answers. His last delivery had been made that morning, but the journey back to him had taken nearly a decade.